All right, go ahead. Grab your Bibles. Open up to Acts chapter 17. We'll just be in verse 31 this morning. Acts 17:31. As we wrap up our series, The Humming of Unseen Harps. Perhaps the most powerful humming that we hear today, as we talk through this sort of spiritual tinnitus idea, that we've got these echoes from an unseen realm that we hear all the time. Perhaps the most powerful one is justice itself. We are deeply passionate about justice in our culture today. In fact, it's really the one check on the expressive individualism that otherwise dominates our culture. I've been talking about expressive individualism a lot lately. It's just the idea of you do you, whatever it is that's within you that helps you find meaning and significance in your identity, just do it. That's all that matters. That's the morality that we have. The one place that checks that, though, is with the issue of justice. Because if you doing you infringes upon the rights of other people, makes them feel unloved, unwanted, somehow less than others, well, then that you can't do. So we have this one check on our expressive individualism. We see it everywhere, don't we? We see it everywhere. In the past year, you have undoubtedly watched or read news stories of protests and rallies and seen hashtag campaigns and online outrage mobs for all sorts of different issues. Human trafficking, police brutality, racial inequalities, or global issues, of course. I don't need to just think U.S., but the stuff that's going on around the world that gets people amped up and concerned. In fact, I would be willing to bet that on your way to this building this morning, if you came from any distance at all, you probably passed at least one house that had some sort of yard sign out front talking about justice. Most likely, the most common one, in this house we believe. Got a list of statements that we believe. No human is illegal. Women's rights are human rights. Black lives matter. Which we'll talk about in a moment, by the way. Those are all largely Christian sentiments. But here's the thing. We drove by those signs, or others like them. If you drove, again, any length at all, you probably also drove by some other signs, or saw some flags, or maybe a sticker on the back of a car. So maybe we got Black Lives Matter on one side, and then you also came across a Blue Lives Matter flag, or sign, or sticker on the back of a car. And now things start to get complicated, don't they? Because it's feeling easy to begin with. People matter, we get that, okay. But now there's a certain conflict, and so it kind of raises the big question for us, of course, what do we do when we disagree? We're all passionate about justice, but we don't agree about justice. Hence the constant bickering in our culture, the rancorous discourse that marks social media, cable news, everything else. Why? Because we have no common ground on which to stand anymore. Because we used to stand on, even if we weren't all Christians, sort of a largely Judeo-Christian ethic. But at this point in our culture, we're a post-Christian culture, that's passed us by. And so what happens? We're planting signs in our front yard, and it feels like we're planting it into bedrock. But if we eliminate the Christian story from this whole conversation, we're going to quickly discover that it's a sinkhole and not a bedrock. There's nothing there that we're building on. There's no ground at all. And that's really my contention this morning. This is what I'm going to try to argue here, is that to pursue justice, that humming we all hear, that sense that we all have, that we need to be working for this, we need a ground, a motivation, and a hope. If we're going to really do justice in this world. We could actually phrase those as questions even, this ground, this motivation, this hope. The ground question is really the what question. What is justice exactly? How do we determine that? The motivation is the why question. Why would I care about this? Why would I bother about this? Certainly, why would I sacrifice about this? And then there is the hope, which is, as I'll have to explain when I get there, sort of the when and even really the who question. So that's what we're going to cover here. The what, the why, the when, the ground, the motivation, the hope. And in one sentence, Paul makes this very point. And so we're going to have to do a little bit like what we did with the Lord's Prayer. We're going to try and drag out as many of the implications as we can from this one sentence here, Acts 17, verse 31. This is Paul preaching to the Athenians. So he's preaching to a group of people who have no familiarity with the Judeo-Christian ethic. There was no Christian ethic at this point, and these aren't Jews. So speaking to pagans, and what does he say? He says, "For God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He's given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead." That's going to be our guide as we go through here. So first, the ground, the what question. What exactly is justice? I have said throughout this series that our dominant culture is one of expressive individualism. So again, you do you. Whatever it is that makes you you, you express that. If that's the story we tell, though, about how the world really works, then we're going to get pinned in very quickly when it comes to issues of justice and morality. So Alasdair MacIntyre, who's an ethicist and a philosopher, wrote a very important book called After Virtue. He was a Marxist philosopher, but started to realize that his Marxist underpinnings weren't helping him out when it came to some of the things that he knew to be true about ethics. And so he talked about our ethical framework in this new culture, and he called it emotivism. Emotivism in the sense... in essence, he's saying our morality is at this point a matter of taste, aesthetics, a gut feeling, if you will. But that's how most of us approach morality. Here's how he defines it. So he says, emotivism is the doctrine that all evaluative judgments, and more specifically all moral judgments, are nothing but expressions of preference and expressions of attitude or feeling. So that's emotivism, and that is how we often speak of morality today. It feels right. I know in my heart it's a good thing. That's sort of the ethical framework. Except that when it comes to matters of justice, it becomes completely unlivable. Like this framework no longer works and nobody thinks it works. And again, one of the main points of this whole series is if it's not livable, if it doesn't work, if it doesn't make sense, then maybe we should tell a different story. Because let me frame some of our ethical judgments that I think all of us in this room would probably agree upon, and probably many people outside this room would agree upon as well. Let me frame them in terms of emotivism. Tell me how they sound to you. I don't like that the Taliban is refusing education to women and torturing and murdering members of the LGBTQ population. It didn't feel right to me when the Chinese Communist Party put roughly 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps to rape and torture them, and specifically as an attempt to eradicate their culture. I think it's wrong to abuse children sexually. But hey, you do you. Who am I to say that your racial abuse of people of color is wrong? If that's what gives your life meaning, like if that's who you think you are on the inside, then you need to express that. Those are horrific statements, aren't they? Like you're all as disgusted as I am right now. I had to say them out loud. That's awful. Somebody's going to just cut that one section out and it's going to go viral on YouTube. So this is my last Sunday here. Thanks, everyone. Hope the renovation goes well. No, these are horrific statements, of course, and I'm disgusted even saying them, but they follow logically from expressive individualism. They are the logical outworking of an emotivist understanding of ethics. And again, if your story is unlivable, if this is where what you think leads you necessarily, get a better story. Tell a better story, one that makes sense of the world as we actually experience it. So like if you know that those things are bad, get yourself an ethical framework that allows you to say that. And more and more atheists are coming to realize this. I quoted an article recently, The Turning Tide of Intellectual Atheism, and that's what is being argued at this point with many prominent atheists, especially in Europe. Here's one. I've quoted him already in this series, French atheist philosopher Luc Ferry. He said, even materialists, like secular philosophers, and I'm quoting him here, he says, have never been able to refrain from passing continuous moral judgment on all and sundry, which their whole philosophy might be expected to discourage them from doing. And by the way, this is not just fancy secular philosophers. This is everyone. Again, some of the people who are the most judgmental are the people who are the least religious in our society. A social justice warrior, your stereotypical social justice warrior would be a really good example of that, although not the only one. So he goes on, Ferry says, I can't invent the imperatives of the moral life. That's a stunning admission. I can't invent it. But they seem to impose themselves on me as if they came from elsewhere. I'm not making this stuff up. It's like it's just there. It's hardwired into my soul. I don't know. That's the point. All right, so let's talk about that question, because that's the ground question, right? Is from where did these moral imperatives come then? How do we ground this morality that seems to impose itself on us from elsewhere? And by the way, this is not easy to do, because there are not necessarily agreed upon beliefs. Like, we're all the product of our culture. And so our culture has dictated a lot of this. Things that we hold very dear here in this culture, like the idea of human dignity or the need for universal human benevolence. You take care of people, whoever they are not universal concepts. In fact, many cultures would reject that explicitly. The overwhelming majority of cultures throughout history, and including many still today, would not assume that all people are equal. It's actually built on the understanding that it's really unequal. Some people are better than others. I'm not talking about like, well, you got, better athletic gifts or superior intellect. I mean, just you as a person have more dignity than some people around you, which is why every culture on the planet has practiced slavery at some point or another. Because what is slavery? You matter less. I matter more. Infanticide, and practiced throughout history, still practiced today, in abortion. But, we're talking children as old as 2, being like, you know what? You're not going to make it as a Spartan, so we're going to leave you on the side of a hill. Sorry. Or what about the mistreatment of women, which has been, again, almost endemic throughout history? Human sacrifice, which is very definitely an expression of, because I matter more, I'm going to go ahead and kill you so the gods are nice to me. And this is practiced, fairly recently. Or something like Hindu practice of sati, where a widow is burned on her husband's funeral pyre. Because, once the man is gone, you don't even rate as a being anymore. So this is not common thinking. That's my point. This whole idea of universal dignity and benevolence is not common at all. So where do we ground it? Where's this coming from? Can we ground it in culture? That might be the first place we would look. Now, no doubt, culture is where we learn our morality. That is true. I get that. But is culture sufficient to establish the moral standard? Yes or no? Well, if we ground it in culture, it would mean that we can never then pass judgment on any other culture. And I've gone through a couple of examples of this. Like, your moral outrage at what the Taliban is doing to gays and lesbians is honestly your problem, because you're judgmental. Who are you to say? That's what their culture teaches. Just because your culture teaches something else doesn't mean you get to tell them they're wrong. Or the Chinese Communist Party and concentration camps, the Nazis for that matter. C.S. Lewis made this point 80 years ago. We're still having this conversation. The problem with this way of thinking is then how can you say the Nazis were wrong? That whole Holocaust thing. That might just be an expression of German culture. Are we really willing to say that being anti-concentration camps is just a matter of cultural preference? I would guess that most of us are unwilling to say that. I have conversations like these a lot. I have talked to a few people who really dig in their heels here. And so they're like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying, because they want to be logically consistent and they don't want to admit I'm right. And so it goes really badly. So they'll dig in their heels here, but even if you dig in your heels here, you're still going to lose this argument because you can't call any cultural practice evil. That's what you're saying here. But that itself is a moral judgment that transcends culture. So who are you to say, in my culture, we judge other cultures? And you just told me I can't do that. So here you are judging another culture, which you just said you can't do. You lose either way. So let's not ground it in culture. What about grounding it in science? This is maybe a more profitable avenue to explore. Except the problem with science, as we keep coming back to in this series, is that science is built on empirical observation. So science is there to observe and describe, which means that you cannot, scientifically speaking, move from is to ought. Science cannot make that jump. We've moved into metaphysics at that point, and metaphysics means above science, basically. So you cannot move from is to ought. Science could, social sciences in particular, could very accurately describe the goal of a culture. So in our culture, for example, we have a goal of equality. And it could tell us that. And it could, do polls and studies and all that kind of stuff. It could also maybe help us understand how best to achieve that goal. So we would maybe want to take a scientific look at whether or not affirmative action leads to equality or not. We could get some metrics in place. We could do some studies and all that kind of stuff. But what science still cannot do is tell us why equality is worth doing in the first place, worth pursuing in the first place. That's not scientific. That's philosophical. That's theological, something like that. Thomas Nagel, I've quoted him before. He says this, from our Darwinian perspective, our impressions of value, if constructed realistically, are completely groundless. This is an atheist admitting this, right? It's groundless. There's the sinkhole that I was talking about. Let me give you an example of this, because I want to make sure we make this concrete, right? So let's take the issue of eugenics, which is basically the idea that people are not equal. So some people have better genes than others, very Darwinian idea. And so the practice of eugenics through either concentration camps or perhaps forced sterilization or something like that could eliminate disease, immorality, and crime. Now, thankfully, we don't do much of this. It's still around, though. Of course, there are still people who would like to abort or sterilize those with genetic disorders that lead to children with special needs and things like that. That's eugenics. It's a barbaric practice, but it's there. So it's still here to some extent. But what's interesting about eugenics is that phrase that I just had about where we can eliminate disease, immorality, and crime. That's a quote from a science textbook from the 20s and the 30s, which is sort of the high point of eugenics. Woodrow Wilson has the unique distinction of probably being our most racist president. Tremendous advocate of eugenics, specifically. What flipped the switch on eugenics? Where we now go, you know what? Maybe that race isn't inferior. And it's horrible that anyone ever said that. It wasn't science that flipped the switch, because science can't flip that switch. Science didn't wake us up to the horrors of eugenics. What woke us up to the horrors of eugenics were the World War II death camps. When you see eugenics practiced, and it arouses the moral intuition in us, well, no, that was wrong. And that was the death of the eugenics movement right there, because we recognize it's unlivable. And again, if it's unlivable, discard it. Just discard it. So what ground do we have? It wasn't culture. It wasn't science. I don't know where else we're going to turn, right? We're standing in a sinkhole at this point, which is difficult to do. Look at how Thomas Jefferson expressed it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal. So there was the ground. I also love that he said self-evident. I'm not even going to argue this, because it gets really difficult to argue it unless you point to the Bible. And so he also says created. But if you reject the myth of creation, what then? That's just a fairy tale, guys. Okay, but then what happens now? Atheist Yuval Harari wrote a book called Sapiens. He says this. He says, Homo sapiens has no natural rights, just as spiders, hyenas, and chimpanzees have no natural rights. This is a myth, guys. This doesn't make sense, all right? What that means then is your yard sign's not looking so good at this point. We just had to X out every single one of them. because either you've eliminated the possibility of dignity and rights altogether from a scientific materialistic standpoint, or you've eliminated that any of those statements are anything other than a matter of personal taste, if you go the expressive individualist route. But here's the problem. We all live like those things are true still. We live like people have rights. The ought is still there. We have to make sense of that. Let me quote Christian Smith at this point. He wrote a book called Atheist Overreach, which I'll refer to a couple of times. He makes this argument at length if you want to really dig into it. But he says this: what might we be warranted in believing is right and wrong, good and bad, worthy and unworthy? For Homo sapiens scratching out an existence on the skin of this tiny planet, spiraling around in an empty and inherently purposeless cosmos, would that call for a moral commitment to universal benevolence and human rights? I'm afraid, as far as I can see, that it would not. That's his point. He's saying you strip out the Christian story, we're just scratching out existence, we're just chemical scum on a tiny planet. Do you get universal benevolence from that? No, of course not. So where do we get it? It's Paul. Paul leads us out of this morass. When he says, God will judge the world with justice. That's the ground. The ground is God's being. He is just. He is the definition of just. But that means that justice is now an objective concept. And we have a moral intuition that says death camps are bad. Why? Because God wrote his law on our hearts. It's stamped there as part of the image of God. Defaced? Yes, absolutely. But there as part of the image of God. And it is an absolute standard so that it transcends culture and judges every culture at some point or another. But the whole pursuit of justice resonates with us. We hear the humming because we're created in his image to represent him to the world, including to represent his justice. The whole of our ethical system, here in the West at least, could be summed up in creation and Christ. Because from creation we get the image of God in humanity as equal worth and dignity of every person. And from Christ we get the command to love others, even to love our enemies. And it is a universal command, as Jesus makes clear, parable of the Good Samaritan and all of that. So if you grew up in the West, then maybe not all of you did, but if you grew up in the West, your moral intuition is entirely Christian. It is entirely Christian. And it doesn't make sense if you eliminate Christianity. So your whole moral intuition that is Christian, if you get rid of Christianity, it's like trying to sit in the tree when you saw it off of the trunk. I mean, you can sit there, but you're going to be lying on the ground and you'll probably be hurt. So that's the ground. Let's now look at the motivation, the why question. If you're here today and you're skeptical of Christianity, you might be a little bit confused as to why I'm preaching about justice, to persuade you to believe in Christianity. Because the church has been so unjust throughout the centuries. And that is a legitimate critique. It's often overstated, but that's a conversation for another day. It's clear, though, that there is legitimate critique here. There are individual failures. Christians who have been racists. Of course, you always go back and kind of wonder, what do you mean by Christian exactly? Like, define your terms here. This is becoming more and more important. I read a study just this week that the term evangelical is at this point a political category and no longer a religious category. It exploded during the Trump years, but the problem is this growth in evangelicals that we've seen, they don't go to church and they don't believe in Christianity. So other than that, they're evangelicals. So it's a political category at this point. So it's the same sort of thing where I go, what do you mean by a Christian did this? Does that just mean like you grew up in the West at a time when pretty much everyone was a Christian? Or are we talking about somebody who was actually saved by God? But even still, there are individual failures, no doubt. And then there are institutional failures. I mean, never the whole of every church everywhere, of course, but there are far too many churches, far too many pulpits, dedicated to the defense of slavery, the defense of segregation, and all the rest. And I mention those two in particular, of course, because no issue gets our blood boiling faster today than issues of race. from maybe sexuality, although they're tied together in a lot of ways. And I also mention it because it's an ongoing issue. I know we think of slavery as something that ended in 1865 or so. Even still, at this moment, you go to places like Mauritania and Haiti, and fully 4% of the population is enslaved. You look at places like India and Pakistan, where it's about 1% of the population. You're like, well, 1%, that's a pretty small percentage. You got 1.3 billion people in the nation, though. That's 13 million slaves in India, which is more than all the slaves that were brought to the New World during the transatlantic slave trade. This feels significant, doesn't it? And huge chunks of Africa and Asia, other parts of the world, of course, still have a percentage at least, even if it's a smaller percentage. There are more slaves in the world today than there were in the 19th century. Partly because the population's higher, but for other reasons as well. So what are we doing about it? No. Let's take it one step back, actually. Why would we do anything about it? Why would we inconvenience ourselves to help people that we don't know? What will motivate us to take these sorts of steps? And remember, belief in universal human dignity is a product of Judeo-Christian ethics. So if there's no Judeo-Christian God, what's motivating us now? Clearly, it's not just an innate motivation, otherwise we'd see it everywhere. There are certain things you can see in every single society. They're opposed to unjust killing, lying, stealing, things like that. But this isn't universal, otherwise there wouldn't be slaves. Let me quote Christian Smith again, because he kind of just draws out the sorts of things that we all agree upon, but then asks the big question at the end of it. He says, let us say that we want on moral grounds everywhere to eliminate slavery, child abuse, political imprisonment and torture, the sex trade, and the like. Good? Nodding our heads so far? Yes, we would like to do that. Let us agree that we ought to live in a world in which people and nations do what they can to stop disease epidemics. By the way, he wrote this before the pandemic. And we're like, yeah, definitely, okay? Aid the victims of catastrophe. We've got a group of men doing right now, and oppose the gross exploitation of the poor, no matter where and to whom these happen. And let us suppose that it's not only perhaps situationally beneficial, but also truly morally good for people to be kind, thoughtful, and fair to other people. Are we in agreement there? Does this sound good? Like, yes, that's what I think this world should look like. All right, then he asks the question, why? Why would we think that? What is the motivation? You cannot look to nature for your motivation. Never mind the fact that nature doesn't provide a ground for that. I mean, nature, if it teaches us anything, is the survival of the fittest, which means, when people get wiped out, hey, great. Less competition for me. And nature would teach us competition. Nature would also teach us violence, by the way. So we're not going to look to nature, I don't think. Is it just these feelings of justice, our moral taste? Is that going to spring from a secular materialism or progressivism? No, quite the opposite. So I'm going to do something I try never to do, which is quote a comment from an article. Because, and this is the 11th commandment, you should never read the comments. It's bad. It's bad for everyone. But here it is. It's Tim Keller's fault. He quotes the comment from a New York Times piece a little while ago. But this is the commenter says this. He says, you are not a unique snowflake. You are not special. You're just another piece of decaying matter on the compost pile of this world. This guy's got to be fun at parties, right? That's all I can think as I read this. Nothing of who you are and what you will do in the short time you are here will matter. Everything short of that realization is vanity. It's the first 2 weeks of this series right there, by the way, because that is exactly right if you strip the transcendent out of the equation. Let's applaud him for being logically consistent, at least right up until he says this. So, as a result of all of that, so you're just chemical scum, okay? Everyone good? Decaying compost. In light of that, so celebrate life in every moment, admire its wonders, and love without reservation. What? I have never seen the cognitive dissonance of our society expressed so vividly. And that's why I quoted the commenter here. You just cannot go from the one to the other. It makes no sense. But let's focus in on that last phrase, because that's the one that really matters for us today. Love without reservation. because you're decaying matter and nothing that you do will matter, so you better make sure you love. Reminds me of the very sarcastic quip by Russian philosopher Vladimir Solovyov. I can't speak Russian. Solovyov? He was trying to sum up our ethics of today. He said this: man descended from apes, therefore we must love one another. That's what we were taught. And it doesn't make any sense, guys. So if you're here today and you believe those two, pause. Think about this deeply. But I want to be very fair, because I've not given us all the possibilities yet. So maybe the why question is a question of social contracts. So what I mean by that is if we all sort of agree on some rules, it promotes mutual flourishing. Like if we all kind of agree that it's best not to just murder people randomly, you and I both have a better chance of not dying early. And we're all on board with that, so cool, good agreement right there. There is a problem already here because, of course, peace and order are relative terms then, and we can't adjudicate. So the Taliban thinks the best way to promote peace and social order is for women to stay in the homes. They don't need education because that's not what they're there for. And if anyone is going, well, hang on now, all right, so we've got something more than social contracts that's needed here. But even still, I get it. The mutual flourishing thing is real. We can agree that we benefit from social contracts even now. We all have agreed to stop at red lights because we prefer not to get T-boned or to T-bone others. So great. Social contracts work. We have a better shot of pursuing happiness if we set certain boundaries around things like life and liberty and property. And that's where our social contracts often go. But there are two problems with the social contract approach. First, it is a morality of self-interest. I'm only doing this so that my interests are taken care of. And that's going to be pretty flimsy motivation, as we'll see. Second problem is that it's limited in scope. Will not give us that sense of universal benevolence that most of us feel like we're called to, that we should take care of all people everywhere. So self-interest is a really dubious ground for morality because you're going to do the whole social contract thing and constrain yourself and whatnot so long as it's in your interest. And the instant that it isn't any longer, why would you continue to do it? And so it raises the problem of what they call the sensible knave, back in the days when people called people knaves. But, the shrewd opportunist, if you want it in contemporary terms, of everyone else should play within the rules, and I'm not going to. Because it's beneficial for me if everybody else does this, and it's really beneficial for me if I just step outside it. Good that everybody else pays their medical bills, because that way hospitals keep running so that when I get sick, I've got somewhere to go, but it's also good for me if I don't pay my medical bills. There's no way to convince the shrewd opportunist on a social contract argument that they should do this all of the time, at least. The classic example of this is Diego Maradona, of course, soccer player for Argentina, who was very pleased anytime the referee called England for fouling him, hacking at his ankles and all that kind of stuff. Right up until the ball was up here and the goalkeeper was coming for it and he's kind of short and he jumped up and he punched the ball into the net and won the semifinal against England. That's the shrewd opportunist. There should be rules, there should be boundaries, the referee should blow his whistle, but if I can get away with it, then that's even better for me. Because it's a morality of self-interest right there. And of course, what do we say in response? We say that's not fair. But fair assumes some sort of objective moral standard that doesn't exist. It also assumes, again, people are going to be willing to play along with your objective standard. Do you think this is going to work if you tell Hitler this kind of stuff? Hey, Hitler, we got a social contract. Don't think he cares. Another problem with this one is that it depends on us all deluding ourselves. That's what we're trying to say. So let's all pretend like these rules exist. And at a certain point, people are going to go, we've got our feet planted in midair, so I'm going to stop pretending now. And all you can do is say, no, it's better if we're delusional. It still seems like a dubious basis for morality. But the second reason is that whole idea that it'll be limited in scope. Why? Here's what I mean by that. There's no reason to inconvenience myself to help slaves in Mauritania, which I'm going to go out on a sturdy limb here and guess that most of you couldn't find on a map. And I don't say that to insult your knowledge of geography, but to show you how unimportant Mauritania is to us. So this social contract, Mauritania has nothing to do with that. It does not provide for our mutual flourishing here in this culture. If anything, if we buy products from Mauritania, we benefit from the fact that they've got slave labor there because it's cheaper for us here. And we all know that we buy stuff that has been made by slaves, or at least really, really, really close to slaves. Why would we inconvenience ourselves to do anything about that, right? It's no practical benefit to me. Doesn't promote my flourishing. And Christian Smith again, if morality only exists to benefit us, then I will be moral with people I wish to benefit and who might benefit me. And that's it. So it's a very limited scope. You see the problem. If we don't have a vested self-interest within the secular story, at least, for pursuing justice, compassion, and equality, what then? There are only two options available to us at this point, if we're honest with ourselves, which most of us are not. One is to jettison those values and just go full-on expressive individualist. I'm just going to live for me, and I don't care about your rules, which are made up anyway. Or we find a better story, right? Find a better story, one that makes sense of the world as we experience it. That better story is Christianity. Tom Holland wrote a book not that long ago. He's a secular progressivist, by the way, not a Christian, nothing like that. Wrote a book called Dominion just recently, and he said, although his personal beliefs in God faded during his teen years, he's come to realize that his most fundamental intuitions about the world are still Christian. And so he lists things like human rights, universal concern for the vulnerable, sexual restraint, humility, the idea of moral progress, like the fact that the arc of history is bending anywhere whatsoever, that those are all inheritances that he has received from Christianity. I love the way he says it, too, that all these things, they're like dust particles, invisible to the naked eye, but breathed in by the religious and the secular alike. So we've all got these values. We're breathing them in. But that better story that he's talking about, these intuitions, they provide the better motivation as well. Why? Because Paul tells us, God will judge. And if God will judge, it means that our behavior matters. The whole nothing you will do matter thing, that's not true. The sensible knave, the one who breaks the rules because it's in his interest, he gets punished in the end. Not only that, the God who judges is the Christian God. He's given proof of this to everyone by raising Jesus from the dead. And by raising Jesus from the dead, he vindicates Jesus' message and life. Because Jesus didn't just teach all of this, of course, but he lived it as well. Jesus lived nonviolence. Like a lamb led to his slaughter, he was silent. So nonviolence, didn't retaliate. He lived a love of enemies, which is all of us, by the way. God demonstrated his own love for us in this while we were still sinners. While we were still God's enemies, Christ died for us. Human dignity, how many times do we see Jesus affirming the worth of people of different gender, religion, race, economic status, over and over and over again. This is why Rodney Stark wrote an important book published by Princeton University Press. It's not like put out by Crossway or something like this. Like this is serious academic study. He says it's only in Christianity, even among the monotheisms, that the idea developed that slavery was sinful and should be abolished. It's the only religion that would lead us to that conclusion. That's so important. Now, Paul couldn't burn the institution down, which some people say he should. Paul said, obey your slaves, obey your masters. Oh, how can you say that, Paul? What was Paul going to do? He's like one guy from a backwater province with a sect that's got like 19 people in it. He wasn't about to take on Caesar. He couldn't do a blog post that was going to go viral. Like that wasn't a thing back then. So here's the thing, though. Somebody put it, he might not have had a flamethrower to burn the thing to the ground, but he did light the spark that did burn it to the ground. And that's Philemon, by the way, in particular. Preached on that in the series called Epiphany, if you want to hear that talk about Philemon. But what happens then, once Christianity does spread enough that it has some cultural influence, within just a few centuries of Christ, you have Gregory of Nyssa preaching the only extant argument from antiquity, the only one we have in existence still, that slavery is wrong and should be abolished. And guess what happens in the Christian West for the next 1,000 years? Slavery is abolished. It's nowhere in Europe in that time, except in like parts of Scandinavia and stuff that were immune from Christian influence at that point. The slave trade started up with the era of navigation and exploration and all of that, over the strenuous objections of the church in Rome. You can read what the Pope had to say about this. I mean, it's anathema, he says. We've forgotten that part when we tell the history story, but it's there. And the slave trade was unquestionably, undeniably abolished because of evangelical revival and efforts under men like John Wesley and William Wilberforce. Even more recently, you look at Dr. King in our culture here and his fight against racism, structural inequalities, segregation, and the rest. What does King say? He says, our actions must be guided by the deepest principles of our Christian faith, because that's the motivation. What are some of those principles? Nonviolence, love as the regulating principle of our lives, even our enemies, and hope in the life to come, which takes us to the last section. I'm a little bit briefer here, which is good, because hope, the when and who question. The pursuit of justice very quickly creates disillusionment in our lives. We live in an age of anxiety in so many ways because we're more aware than ever of just how bad this world is. And we know we can't do anything about it. And that's hard. Like, what can be done for the Uyghurs? I think about this a lot. I can't do anything for them. Raise awareness, but even then, the world's aware. The CCP does not care that the world is aware. They'll just keep denying it. We can try diplomatic means, economic pressures. Maybe we'll do that, but that means the price of all of our goods will go up, and most of us aren't willing to count that cost. Short of nuclear war, I'm not sure what can do it, and are we willing to risk nuclear war for it? Because that seems like maybe even worse than concentration camps. Hopeless. That's the word we're looking for. What about when we talk about racial unrest? That's been getting better at least, right? It feels like it's never going to get better. You see what I mean about disillusioned? And worse, according to our culture's prevailing story, it doesn't even matter ultimately, because the sun burns out long after humanity has gone extinct anyway, and there's no difference between those who practice good and those who practice evil, because you're still just scum on a decaying planet. No, for hope, we need a definite when and a certain who. The who question first, because we're talking about moral obligation, and that, of course, raises the question, obligated to whom? To whom are we responsible? Again, it's not coincidental that it was Christians who led the anti-slavery movements, because the Christian God is the only God large and good enough to demand it. You talk about something like, we're a pluralistic society, and so everybody's like, there's one ultimate reality, and it, I don't even know what to say. The ultimate reality shines through almost like a stained glass window, and so maybe the blue is Muslims, and the yellow is Christians, and the green is Hindus, and the orange is secular progressives. The problem is, can that ground of being, that ultimate reality, express moral concern? No, because it is not a being. That's a statement that only a very few religions would say. So not being a being means that it can't be concerned. So that's not going to do it. And Eastern religion would be very similar, of course. I mean, what is ultimate in Eastern religion? Unconsciousness. There is no good and evil. It's an illusion. So that's not going to lead to it. So we're kind of stuck. Polytheistic gods are way too small. You want to look to your Greek gods for moral advice, you're going to do weird things. I'll just put it that way. You can read your Greek mythology to get that. No, we need the immense God of monotheism. Why? Because only the gods of the three great monotheistic faiths make moral demands, and can make moral demands because they promise reward and threaten punishment. That is, there is a life to come. And that's what we need if we're going to have that sense of moral obligation. There needs to be accountability. And of course, that then takes us to the when question, that day when judgment happens. This gives us not just a better hope, but actually our only hope. Because what does Paul say? He has set a day, there's the when. A day is coming, right? He has set a day when he will judge the world with justice. And I say this is our only hope because what is the proof of that day when things will be set right? It's the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There's so much going on here in this moment. But the logic of justice requires judgment. You cannot have justice without judgment if anybody is breaking any rule whatsoever, which of course we all are. And it's the reality of that judgment to come that provides us with hope. All of a sudden, the logic of eternal punishment makes sense, which I know is one of the primary objections to Christianity today. But without judgment, you cannot have justice. Here's the way Joshua Ryan Butler puts it. He says, "To long for the dawning of the light is by nature to long for casting out darkness. To hope for the healing of the body is implicitly to hope for excising the disease. To pray with Jesus, your kingdom come, is to pray that all those powers that stand unrepentantly opposed to God's kingdom be sent packing. Heaven breaking into earth means pushing hell out." Into hell. But we all want hell out of this existence. We want an end to racism. We want an end to death camps. We want an end to all of it. There's only one way to accomplish that. We cannot have justice without judgment. So to long for the restoration of this world, when all things are made new, what Christ promises is to long for judgment. And here especially is where we see that Christianity tells the best story. Because Christ's death and resurrection teach us two key truths. The resurrection teaches us that a day is coming when he will right every wrong, when the sad things of the world will come untrue, and there will be perfect justice. Not only that, it shows us that even from grave injustice, God can bring great mercy. Because there's no greater injustice than the murder of God's Son, and yet look what he did with that. The hope he brings about as a result of that. Light can overcome the darkness. That also just reminds us that our efforts matter in this life. Like, we should be doing this. But then the second piece that Christ's death and resurrection teaches us is it's his death. His substitutionary death reminds us that we all have the opportunity even now to be on the right side of justice. Because Christ was punished in our place. All our injustice was punished in him. And that's good news. Because you have been unjust in your dealings with people. You have used people as a means to your selfish ends more often than you care to admit. And I would say the same for myself, of course. You see how this is such a powerful humming, don't you? Like, this is loudly ringing in our ears. We all know and feel that justice is meaningful. And that we should pursue it. You can't just you do you. No. We need to be about certain things that matter. So what do we do then? Do we explain away what we know to be true? Or do we listen to this humming? Do we tell ourselves a better story, one that makes sense of the world, makes sense of those moral imperatives that are on us as though they came from somewhere else? Again, it's not just justice, because this is the last week of the series, right? The longing for meaning, that satisfaction we're looking for in this life, that longing for transcendence, the sense that there must be more, the longing for love and beauty and now justice. These are echoes of a tune we haven't heard, news from a country we've never yet visited. But the fact that we can hear the humming reminds us that it's there. And that humming, that turning and going, what am I hearing right now, might just be the beginning of faith. I've said throughout this series, faith might begin with that elusive sense of mystery and wonder. Maybe it begins with a sense of there is justice. I know there's such a thing as justice. Investigate that. Explore that. See where it leads you. See that it leads you to the cross and the empty tomb. Let's pray. Father, we know that this has been difficult in so many ways. These are heady concepts. Wish life could be lived in the really simple, but there are big questions, and big questions require big answers. And there are a lot of different voices clamoring for our attention, and so we've got to sort through them all. I hope that we've done that this morning to some extent at least. But help us to keep sorting, Lord. And maybe more than anything else, help us to hear the one true voice above all others. That would be the voice that we cannot tune out ever. We'd still hear that humming, whichever part of it is calling to us, that we would listen and that we would respond. Pray especially for those who are still asking questions in this room even now. I pray that you'd help them to find answers and to find them in you. I pray for those of us here because we think this is the answer, that you'd help us to think deeply because we love deeply, and we want to be able to explain the hope that we have and the reasons for that hope, our sense of what is true in this world, the better story that we can tell. And we want to know how best to tell that story for your glory and the good of those we love. It's in Christ's name.